October 21st, 1944. The deck of the USS Intrepid pitched violently as a Japanese Zero dove through scattered clouds at 400 miles per hour, its engine screaming toward the carrier's flight deck. Seaman First Class Robert Mitchell from Nebraska gripped the handles of his 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, swinging the barrel to track the incoming fighter. His training had been clear: aim directly at the target, lead it slightly, and fire. Mitchell centered his iron sight on the Zero's engine cowling and squeezed the trigger. 40mm shells erupted from the gun's barrel at a rate of 120 rounds per minute, tracers marking bright arcs through the Pacific sky. Every single round passed harmlessly behind the diving aircraft, missing by what looked like 50 feet. The Zero continued its attack run untouched, releasing a 500-pound bomb that struck the Intrepid's deck and killed 14 sailors. Mitchell stared at his gun's sight in confusion. He had aimed perfectly, his target centered exactly where his instructors had taught him. Yet somehow, impossibly, he had missed completely. What Mitchell didn't understand was that he was trying to solve a physics problem while standing on a rolling deck in the middle of a naval battle. In the 2 seconds his shells took to reach the Zero's altitude, that aircraft had moved 300 feet forward. Mitchell had aimed at where the enemy was, not where it would be when his shells arrived. By late 1944, American anti-aircraft gunners were hitting enemy aircraft less than 5% of the time. They were firing thousands of rounds per engagement, watching their shells explode uselessly in empty sky while Japanese planes pressed home their attacks. But in a laboratory at Bell Telephone in New Jersey, Dr. Clarence Lovell was about to test something revolutionary, a mechanical predictor that calculated trajectories faster than any human mind could process. Instead of aiming at aircraft, gunners would now aim at ghosts in the sky, at points in space where mathematics said their targets would be. The machine would handle the physics, and those ghosts would become devastatingly real. The tropical heat of the Philippine Sea pressed against Seaman Robert Mitchell's dungarees as he stood watch at his 40mm mount on the morning of October 21st, 1944. At 19 years old, the farm boy from Grand Island, Nebraska, had been in the Pacific Theater for 7 months, serving aboard the Essex-class carrier USS Intrepid as part of Task Force 38. Mitchell had everything a gunner needed: steady nerves, quick reflexes, and the mechanical aptitude that came from maintaining farm equipment since age 12. What he didn't have was a single confirmed kill. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was entering its second day, and Japanese naval aviation was throwing everything it had at the American carrier groups, supporting MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Intelligence estimates suggested that Admiral Ozawa's carrier forces were preparing a coordinated strike against the American fleet, using every available aircraft in a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the Pacific War. Mitchell's gun station, Mount 42 on the Intrepid's starboard side, would be among the ship's primary defenses against the expected air attack. The morning briefing had been routine. Japanese aircraft were expected throughout the day, approaching from multiple directions to saturate American defenses. Mitchell would serve as gunner on his 40mm Bofors mount, working with a 4-man crew that included a loader, a trainer who controlled horizontal traverse, and a spotter who called out targets. It was a role Mitchell had performed dozens of times during the ship's combat operations, firing at enemy aircraft and rarely hitting anything despite his careful aim. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weight of frustration had become familiar to Mitchell over the previous months. He had followed his training precisely, centering targets in his ring sight, and leading them by the amounts his instructors had specified during gunnery school back in San Diego. Yet, combat proved far different from shooting at towed sleeves in the calm waters off California. Real Japanese aircraft maneuvered violently, diving and climbing at speeds that made calculation impossible. The ship itself rolled and pitched in Pacific swells, adding another layer of complexity to targeting problems that already exceeded human ability to solve. The statistics supported Mitchell's frustration. Across the Pacific Fleet, anti-aircraft gunners were consuming ammunition at staggering rates while achieving minimal results. The average 40mm mount expended over 800 rounds, confirmed aircraft kill. Some ships had fired thousands of rounds during major engagements without downing a single enemy plane. The Navy's own combat analysis revealed that less than 5% of anti-aircraft shells fired in combat came close enough to enemy aircraft to inflict damage. The problem wasn't courage or dedication. American sailors stood at their guns through hours of attacks, firing until their weapons overheated and their ammunition lockers ran dry. The issue was mathematics. When a Japanese aircraft dove toward a carrier at 400 miles per hour, a 40mm shell fired from that ship's deck took approximately 2 seconds to reach the aircraft's altitude. In those 2 seconds, the attacking plane traveled nearly 1,200 feet forward. Gunners aiming directly at their targets were essentially shooting at ghosts, firing at positions their enemies had already left. The phenomenon had a technical name: deflection error compounded by time of flight, lag. It was the same principle that made duck hunters swing through their targets and trap shooters lead clay pigeons. But in naval anti-aircraft gunnery, with targets maneuvering in 3 dimensions while the gun platform itself moved through ocean swells, the calculations became impossibly complex. A gunner needed to predict not only where his target would be when his shells arrived, but also account for his own ship's motion, wind effects on the projectiles, and the ballistic characteristics of his ammunition at varying ranges and angles. Human brains simply couldn't process all these variables quickly enough to generate accurate firing solutions during the chaos of combat. Mitchell wasn't alone in his inability to hit maneuvering targets. Gun crews throughout the Pacific Fleet reported identical experiences: perfect sight pictures that resulted in shells exploding harmlessly behind diving aircraft, tracers marking beautiful arcs through empty sky, while enemy planes continued their cast attack runs untouched. Combat camera footage from carrier battles showed the scope of the problem. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns firing simultaneously at incoming Japanese aircraft, creating spectacular displays of firepower that rarely translated into actual kills. The handful of gunners who achieved consistent success possessed intuitive understanding of deflection shooting that couldn't be taught through conventional training. These natural shots could estimate lead angles instinctively, compensating for all the variables through some combination of visual processing and pattern recognition that remained mysterious even to the men themselves. But these exceptional individuals represented perhaps 2% of all anti-aircraft personnel, doing a disproportionate share of the fleet's actual air defense, while the vast majority of gunners struggled with the fundamental impossibility of their task. The first attack came at 09:15 when radar detected a formation of Japanese provincial aircraft approaching from the northwest at 12,000 feet. Mitchell's gun captain, Chief Petty Officer James Walsh, called the crew to battle stations and began tracking the incoming raid using optical range-finding equipment. The Japanese formation consisted of 18 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, escorted by a dozen Mitsubishi, A-6M0 fighters, all belonging to what remained of Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier air groups. Mitchell watched through his gun sight as the enemy aircraft grew from distant specks into clearly identifiable shapes. The Judy bombers flew in a loose V formation, their fixed landing gear and greenhouse canopies distinctive against the tropical sky. The escorting Zeros weaved above and behind the bombers, their more experienced pilots watching for American fighters that might threaten the attack formation. These Japanese aviators had been fighting since the war's opening months, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, who knew their business with lethal efficiency. The order to commence firing came when the Japanese formation reached 8,000 yards range. Mitchell's 40mm mount erupted in synchronized violence with 100 other anti-aircraft guns aboard the Intrepid and her escorts. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder of explosions punctuated by the distinctive pom-pom-pom rhythm of the Bofors guns, firing their 4-round clips. Tracers filled the sky in every direction, creating a deadly crossfire that looked impenetrable from a distance. But appearance differed from reality. Mitchell centered his ring sight on a Judy bomber diving toward the Intrepid's bow, leading the target by approximately 2 aircraft lengths, as his training specified. He pressed the trigger, and felt the mount shudder as 40mm shells streamed toward the diving bomber. His loader fed clip after clip into the weapon, maintaining a steady rate of fire as Mitchell tracked the Judy through its attack run. Every shell missed. Mitchell's tracers passed clearly behind the diving bomber, missing by what looked like 40 or 50 feet, even though his sight picture appeared perfect. The Judy continued its approach untouched, releasing its bomb at 1,500 feet, before pulling up sharply and banking away toward the southeast. The bomb struck the Intrepid's flight deck near the forward elevator, penetrating the wooden planking and exploding in a ready room below. 14 sailors died instantly, while fragments from the blast wounded another 23 men. Mitchell stared at his gun sight in disbelief mixed with growing horror. He had centered the target perfectly, had led it by the amount his instructors specified, had maintained steady tracking throughout the engagement. His gun was bore-sighted correctly. He had tested it on towed sleeve targets just 5 days earlier. Yet somehow he had failed to protect his ship, had watched his shells explode uselessly while a Japanese bomber struck the vessel he was supposed to defend. What Mitchell couldn't grasp was the mathematics underlying his failure. His 40mm shells travelled at 2,800 feet per second, reasonably fast by artillery standards but far from instantaneous. In the 2 seconds those shells took to reach the altitude of a diving bomber, that aircraft, travelling at 350 miles per hour, had moved over 1,000 feet forward. The lead angle Mitchell had been taught to use, approximately 2 aircraft lengths, or roughly 100 feet, compensated for less than 10% of the actual deflection required. The training he had received at gunnery school was based on peacetime exercises against towed targets flying straight and level at predictable speeds. Combat presented entirely different challenges. Maneuvering aircraft at varying ranges and angles, targets that dove and climbed and jinked unpredictably, while gunners fired from platforms that pitched and rolled in ocean. Swells. The gap between training scenarios and combat reality had created a generation of gunners who possessed technical proficiency, but lacked the tools to translate that proficiency into battlefield effectiveness. The phenomenon wasn't unique to Mitchell, or even to the Intrepid's gun crews. Throughout the Pacific Fleet, similar scenes played out during every major engagement. The battle off Samar during Leyte Gulf saw American escort carriers and destroyers fire over 50,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition, while downing fewer than 30 Japanese aircraft. The statistics were even worse during kamikaze attacks, where suicide pilots who maintained steady courses toward their targets should have been easy to hit, yet American gunners achieved kill rates barely exceeding 3%. As Mitchell helped damage control parties fight fires on the Intrepid's hangar deck, he couldn't know that engineers had already solved the problem he had just experienced. In laboratories and proving grounds back in the United States, teams of scientists and technicians were perfecting mechanical directors that could calculate deflection angles automatically, devices that would transform naval anti-aircraft gunnery from guesswork into precision science. These systems would reach the fleet within months, turning average gunners into deadly marksmen and fundamentally changing the balance of naval air warfare. But on this October afternoon, standing amid the smoke and chaos of a damaged carrier while Japanese aircraft continued their attacks against Task Force 38, Robert Mitchell could only wonder why his perfect sight picture had resulted in such catastrophic failure, and whether he would ever develop the mysterious skills that allowed some gunners to hit what they aimed at while the vast majority fired uselessly at empty sky. Dr. Clarence Lovell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the mechanical computer spinning on his laboratory bench at Bell Telephone's Murray Hill facility in New Jersey. The device, roughly the size of a large typewriter, consisted of hundreds of gears, cams, and rotating discs that performed continuous calculations based on inputs fed from tracking systems. When Lovell adjusted the target speed dial, the mechanical computer instantly recalculated the entire firing solution, its output shafts rotating to new positions that represented updated aiming points for anti-aircraft guns. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than asking human gunners to solve impossible mathematics during combat, let machines handle the calculations automatically. It was March 1944, and the Pacific War had revealed a disturbing truth about naval anti-aircraft defenses. American ships carried enormous firepower, their decks bristling with guns of every caliber from 20mm up to 5-inch naval rifles. Yet this impressive armament proved largely ineffective against maneuvering aircraft, with gunners hitting their targets less than 5% of the time, even during favorable conditions. Lovell had spent 18 months studying the mathematics of the problem. When a gunner fired at a crossing target, he needed to aim not at the aircraft itself, but at a point in space where the target would be when his shells arrived. The calculation required knowing target speed, heading, range, rate of climb or descent, and the ballistic characteristics of the particular ammunition being fired. Additionally, the gunner had to account for his own ship's motion through the water, wind effects on projectiles, and the fact that gravity caused shells to follow curved trajectories rather than straight lines. These variables changed continuously during combat engagements. An aircraft diving at 400 miles per hour presented an entirely different deflection problem than the same aircraft pulling out of its dive at 200 miles per hour. Human minds couldn't process the mathematics fast enough, especially under the stress of combat when seconds determined whether a kamikaze struck home or splashed harmlessly into the ocean. But a mechanical computer could solve these equations continuously, updating firing solutions dozens of times per second based on real-time inputs from tracking systems. Lovell's breakthrough came when he realized that the same servo mechanisms used in telephone switching systems could be adapted to drive mechanical calculators. If he coupled these servo-driven computers to radar tracking data and optical rangefinders, the entire system could generate firing solutions automatically, without requiring gunners to perform any calculations whatsoever. The gun crew's job would become mechanically simple: keep their tracking optics centered on the target, while the director computer calculated where to aim their weapons. The prototype Lovell built looked like a mechanical nightmare: racks of gears meshing at odd angles, servo motors spinning constantly, cams and followers translating rotary motion into linear displacement. Yet within this apparent chaos lay mathematical precision. The device could solve the differential equations governing anti-aircraft ballistics, accounting for target motion, platform motion, projectile characteristics, and environmental factors, then output firing commands that directed gun mounts to aim at the proper point in space. Testing began at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, in late 1943. Commander Robert Price, a gunnery officer with 12 years of fleet experience, volunteered to evaluate the experimental system. Price had witnessed the frustrating ineffectiveness of conventional anti-aircraft fire during the Guadalcanal campaign, had watched his gun crews expend thousands of rounds while Japanese aircraft pressed home their attacks with minimal losses. He was deeply skeptical that any mechanical device could improve on human judgment and experience. The test target was a radio-controlled drone aircraft, flying realistic attack patterns at varying speeds and altitudes. Using standard optical sighting methods, Price's experienced gun crew achieved a hit rate of approximately 4%, considered excellent by Navy standards. Their shells exploded near the drone occasionally, but most rounds passed harmlessly through empty sky despite the gunner's careful aim and thorough training. Then, the technicians connected Lovell's director computer to the gun mount. The system required the tracking crew to keep their optical rangefinder centered on the target, while the mechanical computer processed this information and automatically positioned the guns at the calculated aiming point. On the first engagement, the director-controlled mount fired a 3-round burst that destroyed the drone aircraft completely. Hit rate with the mechanical director, 100%. Price examined the wreckage of the drone in stunned silence, then immediately requested additional tests. Over the next week, his crew engaged 12 more drone targets using the director-controlled system. They destroyed 11 of them, with the single miss occurring when a mechanical failure temporarily interrupted power to the director computer. The improvement over conventional methods was beyond anything Price had considered possible. The commander flew immediately to Washington to brief the Bureau of Ordnance on what he had witnessed. Within days, the Navy Department had classified Lovell's invention as most secret and ordered crash program development of production-ready systems. The device would be designated the Mark 51 director for manually aimed weapons and the Mark 56 for fully automatic mounts. Both systems incorporated Lovell's fundamental insight: let mechanical computers solve the ballistics, while human operators handled target tracking. The Mark 51 director, designed for the 40mm Bofors mounts that served as the fleet's primary medium-range anti-aircraft weapons, was simultaneously elegant and complex. The complete system weighed approximately 200 pounds and mounted directly on the gun platform itself. An optical rangefinder provided target distance data, while a rate unit measured how quickly the target's bearing and elevation were changing. These inputs fed into the mechanical computer, which continuously calculated the proper lead angles and elevation corrections. Most revolutionary was the system's output method. Rather than displaying numbers that gunners had to interpret, the director drove the gun mount itself through a servo system. When the tracking operator kept his rangefinder centered on an enemy aircraft, the director automatically positioned the guns to aim at the precise point in space where that aircraft would be when the shells arrived. The gunner's job became mechanically simple. When the director had achieved a firing solution, a light illuminated on the control panel. Press the trigger and the mathematics guaranteed a hit. The engineering challenges were formidable. The mechanical computer had to operate reliably under combat conditions. Violent ship motion, salt spray, temperature extremes from Arctic to tropical environments, and the constant vibration of nearby gunfire. Traditional mechanical calculators, used in accounting or engineering applications, simply couldn't survive such punishment. Lovell's team redesigned every component for combat durability, using corrosion-resistant materials, sealed bearings, and shock-mounted assemblies that could withstand the physical environment of naval warfare. The servo systems presented their own difficulties. The motors that positioned gun mounts had to be powerful enough to swing multi-ton weapons quickly enough to track maneuvering aircraft, yet precise enough to position those weapons to accuracies measured in fractions of a degree. The feedback systems that told the director where the guns were, actually pointing, had to function perfectly despite salt corrosion and battle damage. Any failure in these control loops would cause the system to malfunction, potentially destroying friendly aircraft or leaving ships defenseless during attacks. Production planning began even before testing was complete. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance estimated that equipping the fleet with Mark 51 directors would require manufacturing approximately 15,000 units, an enormous undertaking given the device's mechanical complexity. Western Electric, Bell Telephone's manufacturing subsidiary, took responsibility for mass production, converting several factories to director assembly and training thousands of workers in the specialized skills required for precision mechanical work. By summer 1944, the first production Mark 51 directors were reaching the Pacific Fleet. The devices arrived with strict security classifications and detailed technical manuals, but limited training materials. Gun crews accustomed to manual aiming methods struggled initially with the philosophical shift required. Instead of aiming at targets, they now aimed at empty sky while trusting mechanical computers to handle the ballistics. Many experienced gunners resisted this change, preferring to rely on skills developed through months of combat experience rather than surrendering control to untested machinery. Yet the mathematics proved undeniable. During trials aboard the battleship USS Massachusetts, gun crews equipped with Mark 51 directors achieved hit rates exceeding 60% against drone targets, compared to their previous average of less than 5% using conventional methods. More importantly, the director-equipped crews could engage targets at ranges where manual aiming was essentially useless. Aircraft at 8,000 yards, previously safe from 40mm fire, became viable targets when mechanical computers calculated the firing. Solutions. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators would prove as significant as the tactical advantages. Enemy pilots, accustomed to pressing attacks through curtains of ineffective anti-aircraft fire, suddenly faced situations where American ships seemed to predict their every maneuver. Captured Japanese aircrews described American guns that appeared to fire at empty sky, yet every burst exploded exactly where their aircraft flew moments later. The phenomenon seemed supernatural, as if American gunners possessed precognitive abilities. But on the decks of American warships scattered across the Pacific, the reality was purely mechanical. Hundreds of gears, calculating trajectories, servo motors positioning weapons, and mathematical precision transforming naval anti-aircraft gunnery forever. The question remaining was whether this technological revolution would reach frontline ships before Japanese desperation produced even deadlier threats to the American fleet. The Mark 51 director arrived aboard the USS Intrepid on November 8, 1944, while the carrier underwent repairs at Ulithi Atoll following the damage sustained during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Seaman Robert Mitchell watched as Navy technicians swarmed over his 40mm mount, installing the mysterious device that looked like a mechanical brain grafted onto the gun's existing structure. The director's optical rangefinder protruded from the right side of the mount, while a maze of electrical cables connected the mechanical computer to servo motors that would automatically position the guns. Chief Petty Officer Walsh gathered his gun crew around Mount 42 for the training briefing. The chief had served in the Navy since 1936, had survived Pearl Harbor aboard the battleship USS Pennsylvania, and possessed the healthy skepticism of a man who had seen too many promising innovations fail under combat conditions. He read from the technical manual, with obvious doubt in his voice, explaining that the director would calculate deflection angles automatically and position their guns through mechanical linkages. Mitchell raised his hand nervously. "Chief, how do we know where to aim if the machine is doing the calculating?" The question reflected the psychological barrier that every gun crew faced when transitioning to director control. Years of training had taught them to aim at targets, to estimate lead angles based on target speed and range, to trust their eyes and instincts. The Mark 51 demanded a complete reversal. Keep the tracking optics on the target while the machine aimed the guns at empty sky. Walsh's response came straight from the manual. "You don't aim anymore, Mitchell. You track. Keep that rangefinder centered on the target, and the director handles everything else. When the ready light comes on, you press the trigger, and the bastard dies. Simple as that." But nothing about the system felt simple during those first training sessions. The Intrepid's air operations officer arranged for Marine F-4U Corsairs from a nearby escort carrier to fly realistic attack patterns, while the ship's gun crews practiced with their new directors. Mitchell's first attempt was a disaster. He tried to lead the target the way his training specified, fighting against the servo motors that were trying to position the gun based on the director's calculations. The result was confused movement as human and machine battled for control, with the guns swinging erratically across the sky without ever achieving a firing solution. Walsh grabbed Mitchell's shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Stop thinking like a gunner and start thinking like a tracker. Your job is to keep that optical sight on the target, nothing else. Let the director do its job, and you do yours." Mitchell forced himself to ignore his instincts on the next pass. He centered the tracking optics on an approaching Corsair and concentrated solely on keeping target in his sight picture as the fighter executed a diving turn toward the carrier's bow. The gun mount moved beneath him with surprising smoothness, the servo motors positioning the barrel to aim at a point approximately 200 feet ahead of the diving Corsair. Every instinct Mitchell possessed screamed that he was aiming at empty sky, that his shells would miss by impossible margins. The ready light illuminated on his control panel. Mitchell pressed the trigger. 4 40mm shells erupted from the gun in rapid succession. The rounds travelled through the Pacific air in a precisely calculated arc, converging on the exact point in space where the director's mechanical computer had predicted the Corsair would be. Had this been combat with live ammunition, the Marine fighter would have flown directly into Mitchell's fire and been destroyed instantly. The realization hit Mitchell with physical force. He hadn't aimed at the target. He had aimed at where the target was and going to be, guided by mathematics he couldn't calculate himself, but which the director solved continuously and automatically. The machine had transformed him from a frustrated amateur into a deadly marksman through the simple expedient of removing impossible mental calculations from the gunnery equation. The training continued through November, as the Intrepid prepared to rejoin Task Force 38 for operations against Japanese-held islands in the Philippines. Mitchell's gun crew ran hundreds of practice engagements, gradually learning to trust the director's calculations over their own instincts. The psychological adjustment proved harder than the mechanical operation. Experienced gunners struggled most, their years of manual aiming creating mental barriers that took weeks to overcome. Newer sailors like Mitchell adapted more quickly, having less ingrained habit to unlearn. By December, the Intrepid carried 12 Mark 51 directors, distributed among her 40mm mounts, with conventional optical sights retained on weapons that hadn't yet received the new systems. The carrier departed Ulithi on December 10th, bound for operations in support of the Mindoro invasion. Intelligence warnings suggested heavy Japanese air activity, including increased use of kamikaze tactics by pilots who had embraced suicide attacks as their only effective weapon against American naval superiority. The first test of the Mark 51 in actual combat came on December 13th at 1400 hours, when radar detected a formation of Japanese aircraft approaching Task Force 38 from the west. Mitchell stood at his director-equipped mount as the general quarters alarm sent the crew to battle stations. Chief Walsh called out ranges and bearings while Mitchell scanned the sky through his tracking optics, searching for the targets that radar said were approaching at 12,000 feet. The Japanese formation consisted of 8 Mitsubishi, a 6M0, fighters, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb and piloted by volunteers from the 201st Naval Air Group who had committed to kamikaze attacks against the American carriers. These pilots had been given minimal training in the suicide tactics that Japanese commanders now considered their most effective anti-ship weapon. The Zero's speed and maneuverability made it a formidable kamikaze platform, capable of evading conventional anti-aircraft fire through violent evasive maneuvers that human gunners couldn't track effectively. Mitchell acquired the first target at 8,000 yards range, a Zero diving toward the Intrepid's port quarter at an angle that would have made conventional gunnery nearly impossible. The deflection angle exceeded 30 degrees, requiring lead calculations that human gunners simply couldn't solve accurately during the stress of combat. But Mitchell wasn't calculating anything. He centered his tracking optics on the diving Zero and watched the director's mechanical brain process the geometry. The gun mount swung smoothly to aim at a point in empty sky approximately 300 feet ahead of the diving Japanese fighter. The lead angle looked absurdly large, as if Mitchell were aiming at a completely different patch of sky from where his target actually flew. The ready light illuminated. Mitchell pressed the trigger without hesitation. The first burst of 40mm shells caught the Zero precisely in its engine cowling, armor-piercing rounds, smashing through the Sakai radial engine and detonating the aircraft's fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in a brilliant fireball at 6,000 feet, sending burning debris tumbling toward the ocean far short of its intended target. The engagement had lasted less than 8 seconds from initial acquisition to destruction. Mitchell barely had time to process his first confirmed kill before Walsh was calling out another target. A second Zero had broken through the combat air patrol and was diving toward the Intrepid's starboard beam, its pilot maintaining a steady course that suggested complete commitment to his suicide mission. Mitchell swung his tracking optics onto the new target, forcing himself to ignore the natural instinct to lead the aircraft manually. The director calculated the firing solution instantly, positioning the gun to aim at the precise point where mathematics said the Zero would be in 2 seconds. Mitchell fired a 3-round burst. All 3 shells exploded within feet of the kamikaze, shrapnel shredding the fighter's control surfaces and forcing it into an uncontrolled spin that ended in the ocean 200 yards from the carrier's hull. Across the Intrepid's deck, similar engagements played out at 11 other director-equipped mounts. Gun crews that had spent months firing uselessly at maneuvering targets suddenly found themselves destroying enemy aircraft with consistent, almost mechanical precision. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was immediate and devastating. Aviators who had survived previous kamikaze missions by exploiting the poor accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire now faced weapons that seemed to anticipate their every move. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics from that engagement told the story with brutal clarity. The Intrepid's director-equipped 40mm mounts fired a total of 460 rounds and destroyed 6 enemy aircraft. Hit rate over 50%. The conventional mounts without directors expended nearly 3,000 rounds and scored. The technology gap had created a situation where guns separated by a few feet on the same ship demonstrated order of magnitude differences in effectiveness. Captain John Boland, commanding officer of the Intrepid, compiled a detailed after-action report that made its way to Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters within days. Boland's assessment was unequivocal. The Mark 51 director represented the most significant advancement in naval anti-aircraft capability since the development of radar-controlled fire control for large-caliber guns. He recommended immediate priority deployment to all carriers and major surface combatants in the Pacific Fleet. The Navy's response was swift and comprehensive. Production of Mark 51 directors increased from 200 units per month to over 1,000, as Western Electric converted additional manufacturing capacity to meet fleet demands. By January 1945, virtually every major American warship in the Pacific carried at least partial director equipment, with complete installation planned for all vessels by spring. The effectiveness differential became even more pronounced during the Battle of Okinawa, where Japanese kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity. Between April and June 1945, American ships equipped with director-controlled anti-aircraft weapons achieved kill rates exceeding 60% against suicide aircraft, compared to less than 10% for vessels still relying on conventional aiming methods. The disparity was so significant that the Navy began transferring director-equipped ships to picket stations, where kamikaze attacks were most intense, using the technology as a force multiplier that allowed fewer vessels to provide more effective air defense. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackburn, commanding officer of the destroyer USS Hugh Hadley, experienced the director's capabilities firsthand during a massive kamikaze attack on May 11, 1945. His ship, serving on Radar Picket Station 15 north of Okinawa, came under assault from over 70 Japanese aircraft in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. The Hugh Hadley's gun crews, equipped with Mark 51 directors on their 40mm mounts, shot down 23 confirmed enemy aircraft during a 90-minute engagement that exhausted the ship's ammunition, but prevented any kamikazes from striking the vessel. Blackburn's after-action report noted that his gun crews had achieved their extraordinary results while firing less than half the ammunition that previous engagements against similar numbers of aircraft had consumed. The directors had eliminated the wasteful firing at empty sky that characterized conventional anti-aircraft gunnery, transforming each shell into a precisely aimed projectile that either destroyed its target or passed close enough to force evasive maneuvers that broke up enemy attack formations. The technological advantage provided by director-controlled weapons fundamentally altered Japanese tactical calculations. Intelligence analysis of captured documents revealed that Japanese naval aviation commanders recognized they were facing a new and nearly insurmountable defensive system. Orders issued to kamikaze units in May 1945 specifically warned pilots about American ships with automatic prediction weapons that could destroy aircraft at ranges previously considered safe. Some documents recommended abandoning coordinated attacks in favor of single aircraft missions launched at dawn or dusk, when low-light conditions might degrade director effectiveness. But the Mark 51's optical tracking systems functioned adequately in all but the darkest conditions, and American combat air patrols remained effective at intercepting isolated attackers. The combination of director-controlled anti-aircraft weapons and aggressive fighter defenses had created a defensive umbrella that Japanese aviation simply couldn't penetrate without accepting catastrophic casualties. By summer 1945, American naval vessels equipped with director-controlled weapons were achieving overall kill rates against Japanese aircraft exceeding 50%. Kamikaze attacks that might have destroyed carriers or crippled battleships instead resulted in dozens of Japanese aircraft shot down before reaching their targets. The few kamikazes that did penetrate the defensive screen were often damaged aircraft that had survived multiple hits from director-controlled guns, their pilots wounded and their aircraft barely controllable. Robert Mitchell's personal tally reached 11 confirmed kills by July, making him one of the most successful anti-aircraft gunners in his squadron. Yet he understood that his success derived not from exceptional skill, but from the mechanical precision of the director computer mounted on his gun. The device had done what human brains couldn't, solved impossible mathematics continuously and automatically, while accounting for every variable that affected shell trajectories through three-dimensional space. The transformation extended beyond individual gunner performance. Squadron level, tactics evolved to exploit the director's long-range accuracy, with American ships engaging enemy formations at distances that had previously been considered ineffective. The traditional defensive doctrine of holding fire until aircraft reached 4,000 yards gave way to engagement at 8,000 yards or more, disrupting Japanese attack formations before they could coordinate their final approaches. Yet even as the Mark 51 reached peak effectiveness, the technology that made it possible was approaching obsolescence. The mechanical computers that had seemed revolutionary in 1944 were already being superseded by electronic systems using vacuum tubes and, eventually, transistors. The director's greatest contribution wasn't the specific hardware, but rather the philosophical breakthrough they represented. Recognition that human limitations in processing complex mathematics could be overcome through automation. The final irony emerged after Japan's surrender, when American technical intelligence teams examined captured Japanese documents. They discovered that Japanese engineers had recognized the principles behind director-controlled fire as early as 1942, having studied British experiments with similar systems. Japanese researchers had even constructed prototype mechanical directors that demonstrated promising accuracy during testing. But Japan's collapsing industrial base and critical shortages of precision manufacturing capacity prevented development beyond the experimental stage. The gears, bearings, and servo motors required for reliable director operation demanded manufacturing tolerances and quality control that Japanese industry could no longer maintain. The same resource constraints that forced Japan to embrace kamikaze tactics also prevented development of the defensive technologies that might have countered American director-controlled weapons. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Lovell received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal in October 1945 for his development of the Mark 51 director. The citation credited his invention with saving hundreds of American ships and thousands of sailors' lives during the final year of the Pacific War. But Lovell's own assessment was characteristically modest. In a letter to his wife written shortly after the ceremony, he noted that the director simply allowed average gunners to do what a handful of natural shots had always been able to accomplish through instinct. The real breakthrough, Lovell suggested, was recognizing that human limitations didn't have to constrain weapon system effectiveness. If sailors couldn't calculate deflection angles quickly enough, mechanical computers could handle the mathematics while humans focused on target tracking. This insight would reshape military technology for decades, leading directly to the automated fire control systems, guided missiles, and eventually computerized weapon systems that defined modern warfare. Seaman Robert Mitchell mustered out of the Navy in February 1946, returning to Grand Island, Nebraska, with 11 confirmed kills and a profound appreciation for the mechanical brain that had transformed him from a frustrated amateur into one of the Pacific Fleet's most effective anti-aircraft gunners. He kept a photograph of his gun crew standing beside Mount 42, its Mark 51 director visible in the image as a boxy protrusion that looked unremarkable to anyone who hadn't witnessed its capabilities in combat. Mitchell rarely spoke about his wartime experiences during the decades that followed. When pressed by family members or friends to explain how he had achieved so many kills, his response was always the same. I didn't aim at the planes. I aimed at where they were going to be. The machine did the rest. This simple statement captured the essence of the revolution in naval anti-aircraft gunnery that the Mark 51 Director represented. The statistical legacy of director-controlled weapons spoke louder than any individual story. During the final year of the Pacific War, American ships equipped with Mark 51 Directors shot down over 4,000 Japanese aircraft while consuming approximately 40% less ammunition than would have been required using conventional aiming methods. The technology had multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons by a factor of 10 or more, providing a defensive capability that Japanese attackers simply couldn't overcome. More significantly, the Directors had democratized anti-aircraft gunnery in exactly the same way that gyroscopic gun sights had transformed aerial combat. The small percentage of naturally talented gunners who had achieved consistent success through intuition and experience no longer represented the fleet's only effective defense. Average sailors with standard training could now destroy enemy aircraft with precision that had previously been impossible, transforming naval air defense from an art practiced by a gifted few into a science that any properly trained crew could execute. The lessons learned from the Mark 51 program influenced American military technology development throughout the Cold War and beyond. The recognition that automation could overcome human limitations in processing complex real-time data drove development of increasingly sophisticated fire control systems, from the analog computers used in Korean War-era weapons to the digital systems that equipped modern naval vessels. The philosophical breakthrough that Lovell's team achieved in 1944, letting machines handle mathematics while humans focused on decision-making and target selection, became the foundational principle of military automation. By the time American forces engaged in the Korean conflict just 5 years after World War II's end, the original Mark 51 Directors had been retired from frontline service, replaced by full automated systems that didn't require human gunners at all. The evolution continued through subsequent decades as radar tracking replaced optical rangefinders, electronic computers replaced mechanical calculators, and eventually guided missiles replaced guns entirely for long-range air defense. Yet the fundamental insight remained unchanged. Effective weapon systems required automation to compensate for the mathematical complexity of modern combat. Human operators couldn't calculate trajectories for supersonic targets, couldn't process the sensor data from multiple tracking systems simultaneously, couldn't react quickly enough to counter threats that appeared and disappeared in seconds. Machines could do all these things, freeing human decision-makers to focus on strategic choices rather than mechanical calculations. The Mark 51 Director's greatest legacy wasn't visible in museums or technical specifications. It lived in the approach to military technology that shaped every subsequent generation of weapons. When engineers designed anti-ballistic missile systems, automated point defense weapons, or precision-guided munitions, they built upon the foundation that Lovell's team established: recognize human limitations, automate the mathematics, and let technology multiply human effectiveness rather than replace human judgment entirely. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his final report as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, devoted an entire section to the impact of director-controlled anti-aircraft weapons on the war's outcome. His assessment was characteristically direct. The Mark 51 Director, combined with improved radar and fighter direction, reduced Japanese aerial attack effectiveness by approximately 70% during the final year of operations. This technological advantage allowed the fleet to operate closer to enemy-held territory with acceptable casualty rates, directly enabling the successful campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The human cost of that technological advantage appeared in casualty statistics. American ships equipped with director-controlled weapons suffered approximately 30% fewer casualties from air attack compared to vessels relying on conventional defensive systems. Thousands of sailors survived battles they might otherwise have lost, because mechanical computers solved ballistics problems faster and more accurately than human gunners could manage. The technology had accomplished exactly what Lovell intended. It had saved lives by making defensive weapons devastatingly effective. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.